Spanish era 1565 to 1898. The Portuguese navigator and explorer Ferdinand Magellan headed the first Spanish foray to the Philippines when he made landfall on Cebu in March 1521. A short time later, he met an untimely death with a Raga named Lapu-Lapu on the nearby island of Mactan. After King Philip II, for whom the islands are named, has dispatched the three further expeditions that ended in disaster. He sent out Miguel Lopez de Legazpi, who established the first permanent Spanish settlement in Cebu in 1565. The Spanish city of Manila was founded in 1571, and by the end of the 16th century, most of the coastal and lowland areas from Luzon to northern Mindanao were under Spanish control. Spain propagated the Philippines with the religion called Christianity. Friars marched with soldiers and soon accomplished the nominal conversion to Roman Catholicism of all the local people under Spanish administration. Central government in Manila retained a medieval caste until the 19th century, and the Governor General was so powerful that he was often likened to an independent monarch. He dominated the Audiencia or High Court, was Captain General of the Armed Forces, and enjoyed the privilege of engaging in commerce for private profit. Manila was also the ecclesiastical capital of the Philippines. The Governor General was civil head of the church in the islands, but the Archbishop vied with him for political supremacy. In the late 17th and 18th centuries, the Archbishop, who also had the legal status of Lieutenant Governor, frequently won. Augmenting their political power, religious orders, Roman Catholic hospitals and schools, and bishops acquired great wealth, mostly in land. Royal grants and devices formed the core of their holdings, but many arbitrary extensions were made beyond the boundaries of the original grants. The power of the church derived not simply from wealth and official status. The priests and friars had a command of local language, rare among the lay Spanish, and in the province they outnumbered civil officials. Thus, they were an invaluable source of information to the colonial government. The cultural goal of the Spanish clergy was nothing less than the full Christianization and Hispanization of the Filipino. In the first decades of missionary work, local religions were vigorously suppressed. All practices were not tolerated. But as the Christian laity grew in number and the zeal of the clergy waned, it became increasingly difficult to prevent the preservation of ancient beliefs and customs under Roman Catholic garb. Thus, even in the area of religion, pre-Spanish Filipino culture was not entirely destroyed. Agricultural technology changed very slowly until the late 18th century. A shifting cultivation gradually gave way to more intensive sedentary farming, partly under the guidance of the friars. The socio-economic consequence of the Spanish policies that accompanied this shift reinforced class differences. The datus and other representatives of the old noble class took advantage of the introduction of the Western concept of absolute ownership of land to claim as their own fields cultivated by their various retainers, even though traditional land rights had been limited to usufruct. These hires of pre-Spanish nobility were known as the Principalia and played an important role in the friar-dominated local government. Just like nowadays, family is the most basic unit of society during the Spanish era. We all know that the father is the foundation, while the mother is the light in the family. Basic etiquettes like pagmamano and saying po and opo shows our respect to others, especially in our elders. In terms of food, Spanish era taught us native Filipinos to eat Spanish foods such as bread and ham, and other European goods such as drinks, coffee, and wine. American era 1898 to 1946. 1898. Spain's 333-year rule over the Philippines has been collapsed. Filipino rebels won the Spanish War. Rather than face humiliation from Filipino rebels, Spain sells the archipelago to the United States of America. As America prepared to claim its new colonization, Filipinos argue against one another, returning to a regionalist mentality. During that time, led by General Emilio Aguinaldo, the Philippine flag was raised as a symbol of our independence. Afterwards, General Emilio Aguinaldo declared as the first president of the Republic of the Philippines. As the Declaration of Independence, the Americans opposed was a plans of taking over the colony, and this led to a guerrilla war against the Americans. April 11, 1899. John Hay, the Secretary of State, signing the Treaty of Paris. In this treaty, Spain ceded the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico to the United States after the Spanish-American War. This gave the United States 3 more colonies to control. The Filipinos had not been consulted about American rule. Soon after, the Treaty of Paris was signed. 2 battles broke out between Americans and the Filipinos. The first battle was between the Moros or Muslims in Mindanao and last until 1912. Under Americans' rule, the Filipinos were denied employment and white inhabitants had more rights. The Filipinos were upset with the United States because they thought America was going to support them in their independence. However, America did not trust them. These anti-Filipino feelings result in raids and revolts and overall unhappiness leading to a revolutionary battle. Philippine-American War would cost far more money and took far more lives than the Spanish-Philippine War. Less than 4,000 Americans, while more than 34,000 Filipino lives had been died during their conflict and battle. Atrocities were committed by both sides. The revolution was effectively ended with the capture of General Emilio Aguinaldo in March 23, 1901 at Palanan, Isabela, and was brought to Manila. After the capture of Aguinaldo, the American civil government was established by the Americans in 1901 as William Howard Taft as the first American Governor-General of the Philippines. After that, English was declared as the official language. The Americans propagate education shortly after their arrival in the Philippines. The American military force began to establish schools. Thomasites, a group of 600 American teachers who traveled from the United States to the newly occupied territory of the Philippines. The name Thomasite was derived from the transport vessel USS Thomas, which brought the educators to the shores of Manila Bay. The term Thomasites has since expanded to include any teacher who arrived in the first few years of the American era in the Philippines. They arrived in Manila in August 1901. Thomasites arrived to establish a new public school system, to teach basic education, and to train Filipino teachers with English as the medium of instruction. The implement schools had been established in Manila by the United States. University of the Philippines, Philippine Normal College, namely Philippine Normal University, and other agricultural schools. In 1902, the U.S. Army opened the Philippines' first public school in Corregidor Island. The island was organized as an American military reservation. Corregidor High School was where children of both Filipino and American servicemen assigned on the island studied. In 1935, Commonwealth government under the American rule proposed an election to fill the newly created office of President of the Commonwealth of the Philippines. Was won by Manuel Luis Quezon, and a Filipino government was formed on the basis of principles apparently similar to the U.S. Constitution.
Manuel Luis Quezon hereby solemnly swear that I will faithfully and conscientiously fulfill my duties as President of the Philippines, and I hereby declare that I recognize and accept the supreme authority of the United States of America in the Philippines, and will maintain true faith and allegiance thereto. So help thee God.
When Quezon was inaugurated, the Commonwealth was formally established, featured a very strong executive, a unicameral National Assembly, and a Supreme Court composed entirely of Filipinos for the first time since 1901. Manuel Luis Quezon is the first president of this Commonwealth government in the Philippines. Since Quezon has been inaugurated as the president of the Commonwealth, many changes has been proposed in our country. Americans gave us democracy, which is the greatest legacy that they gave. Under democracy, the government separated into three branches. We have the executive or the president, legislative or the Senate and Congress, and judiciary or the Department of Justice. Public schools have opened up. Protestantism was introduced. There was a separation of the church and state or government. Freedom of religion was practiced. Transportation and communication was improved. Roads, streets, and bridges have been built by the Americans. Hollywood movies have become more popular, and Filipinos learned to watch and play games like basketball, volleyball, boxing, etc. Also, Philippine economy improved. Filipinos learned the value of cleanliness and proper hygiene. Pagmamano was replaced by kissing the cheeks of the parents and elders as a sign of respect. Japanese occupation era, 1942 to 1945. The Japanese occupation of the Philippines was occurred between 1942 and 1945, when the Empire of Japan occupied the Commonwealth of the Philippines during World War II. The invasion of the Philippines started on December 8, 1941, 10 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor. As at Pearl Harbor, the American aircraft were severely damaged in the initial Japanese attack. General Douglas MacArthur escaped Corregidor on the night of March 11, 1942, for Australia, 4,000 kilometers away. The 76,000 starving and sick American and Filipino defenders on Bataan surrendered on April 9, 1942, and were forced to endure the infamous Bataan Death March, on which 7,000 to 10,000 died or were murdered. Japan occupied the Philippines for over 3 years, until the surrender of Japan. A highly effective guerrilla campaign by Philippine resistance forces controlled 60% of the islands, mostly jungle and mountain areas. Filipinos remained loyal to the United States, partly because of the American guarantee of independence, and also because the Japanese had pressed large number of Filipinos into work details and even put young Filipino women into brothels. The Japanese military authorities immediately began organizing a new government structure, often referred to as a puppet government, under which a number of Filipinos served. Although the Japanese had promised independence for the islands after occupation, they initially organized a Council of State through which they direct civil affairs until October 1943. When they declared the Philippines an independent republic, most of the Philippine elite, with a few notable exceptions, served under the Japanese. The Japanese-sponsored republic was headed by President Jose P. Laurel. Philippine collaboration in Japanese-sponsored political institutions began under George B. Vargas, who was originally appointed by Quezon as the mayor of Greater Manila before Quezon departed Manila. During the occupation, most Filipinos remained loyal to the United States, and war crimes committed by forces of the Empire of Japan against surrendered Allied forces and civilians were documented. During the Japanese occupation of the Philippines during World War II, the Japanese influenced the government in the Philippines by enforcing a strict curfew, adding Japanese currency, instituting a military government, and reducing neighborhood government systems by half. They want to gain power over their neighbors and also to oust American and European influences from the region. During the occupation of the Japanese in the Philippines, they ran the Philippines with an iron hand. They instilled fear, declared martial law. They imposed curfews. They ordered that anyone who opposed them, or even those who are just accused of going against the Japanese, were punished and killed. Singing of the national anthem and raising of the national flag was prohibited. Uses of Radios and transmitters was also prohibited. Political parties, elections, and public assemblies were put to a halt. School, printing presses, telegraph, and radio stations were closed down. Everything was controlled by the Japanese. When General MacArthur returned to the Philippines with his army late in 1944, he was well supplied with information. It has been said that by the time MacArthur returned, he knew what every Japanese lieutenant ate for breakfast and where he had his haircut. But the return was not easy. The Japanese Imperial General Staff decided to make the Philippines their final line of defense and to stop the American advance toward Japan. The Kamikaze Corps was created specifically to defend the Philippines. The Battle of Leyte Gulf ended in disaster for the Japanese and was the biggest naval battle of World War II. And the campaign to retake the Philippines was the bloodiest campaign of the Pacific War. But intelligence information gathered by the guerrillas averted a bigger disaster. They revealed the plans of Japanese General Yamashita to entrap MacArthur's army, and they led the liberating soldiers to the Japanese fortifications. MacArthur's allied forces landed on the island of Leyte on October 20, 1944, accompanied by Sergio Osmeña, who had succeeded to the Commonwealth presidency upon the death of Quezon on August 1, 1944. The Commonwealth of the Philippines was restored. Fighting was fierce, particularly in the mountains of northern Luzon, where Japanese troops had retreated, and in Manila, where they put up the last-ditch resistance. The Philippine Commonwealth troops and the recognized guerrilla fighter units rose up everywhere for the final offensive. Fighting continued until Japan's formal surrender on September 2, 1945. The Philippines had suffered great loss of life and tremendous physical destruction by the time the war was over. On July 1946, both the Philippines and the US signed the Treaty of Manila, which recognized the independence of the Philippines.